This is Open to Hope Radio, featuring Dr. Gloria Horsley and her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley, coming to you on behalf of the Open to Hope Foundation, dedicated to those who are looking for hope after loss. Now, here's Dr. Gloria.
Welcome to Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my co-host, Dr. Heidi Horsley. Well, good morning, Heidi. Our guest today is AmyJo Mattheis, and she's walked with thousands of people through grief and loss of a loved one, and had the recent death of her father about 1.5 years ago, and she knows the numbing whisper insisting he'll come back. She's a former pastor and also teaches at Pacific University in California. So welcome to our show, AmyJo.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here.
It's great to have you on today. And I know that you have, as I said, dealt with many people in coaching and walking them through grief. How did the death of your father impact you? And tell us about that.
It was very interesting. That sounds really sterile to say. But at some point, it almost felt like I was watching it from a distance. Having walked through that process with so many people as a pastor. When my dad died, I was no longer practicing as a pastor. And yet I had all the wisdom and information and knowledge of doing it with other people. And for me, when it was me, none of that held true. It was all new. It was all my own. I didn't have a map as to how to get through it. And the other interesting part was the family dynamics that happened all around it were surprising to me, because as the person in the home, the professional in the home who had the wisdom and experience of walking that path with so many people, when I came into the impending death of my father, that was not the role that was given me. I was sort of back to the young child, the youngest child in the family, and the older brothers and sisters made the decisions. It was very, it was almost surreal. It was like nothing I could have prepared for. And I just heard Joan Didion interviewed recently about her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, and I never really got the title until my dad died. I was like, oh, yeah, now I understand. Because I still sort of think he's coming back. Mm-hmm. You know, like, oh, this can't be the end of this. He died July 23rd, 2011.
I was just going to say, I think you're making a really good point that I don't want to let this pass here, and that you still expect him to come back. And I think it takes us a very long time to wrap our arms around the permanence of somebody being gone, especially when they've been in our lives our entire life.
So how old was he, and what did he have, and how did he die?
He was 75, and he had stage 4 bone cancer.
Ah, painful.
So it was very painful. And he was amazing because he wanted to take just enough meds to manage the pain, just enough so that he could still visit and talk and be with people. So for the last 3 weeks of his life, people were coming from all over the country to come to the house and spend time with him and talk with him. And that was what he wanted more than anything. So you could tell that he was uncomfortable and in pain, but he was not going to take more meds because, you know, it messed with his ability to be cognitively present, and he was not going to let that happen. He had a great will, and it really represents my father, because his greatest love was connecting with people. So I think that he lived that out fully in the last weeks.
What was his belief of what happens after death?
You know, one of the things that we had started doing in the community in way of compassion is we had begun to practice some pagan rituals and Native American and that whole cycle of life that is really beautiful of when a flower dies, the seeds go back into the ground to fertilize yet another form of life. And that's what he believed about himself. that he was going back into the ground, and somehow from his life here on Earth, he had fertilized new growth and new life.
So to a certain extent that his energy is throughout the world.
Absolutely. That his energy continues to create new life. And I believe that completely.
Your father was old, and from the world's perspective, and you knew he was going to die, so that you were prepared for it, and he did die, and you're just fine now, right?
No, not at all. I have a wound that I don't think I've begun to really treat yet. It flares up at the most unexpected moments, which can be awkward sometimes. I was just at a work retreat this last weekend with 30 other women, and the opening session, we all had to go around and answer some questions, and it got to me and I couldn't even speak. I was just overcome, and I got out the words, "Dad died a year ago." It was just, it's still something that comes into everything that I do. I've had a really exciting and really life-changing year in terms of going to start my own company and writing a book and doing a TEDx talk, and I've gotten some really wonderful awards, and every time it kills me inside that he's not here to be part of it, because he would have loved it. And so that hurts profoundly. And I try to translate that into what I was talking about before, that part of what I'm doing is my dad's energy, that his life is coming through me.
Well, I'm thinking too, AmyJo, that you're kind of taking his work forward, because it sounds like you guys were on the same page.
Yes.
And now you're being the voice, you're continuing that voice saying there, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that we were going to write a book together, and he had written out the first outline of it, and I still have it, and I hold that. And we just never, I was too busy, and he was too busy, because he kept very, very busy up to the end, and we never really got it launched. So I decided, what I'm doing now is part of what he and I were going to do together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're carrying that with him. I am,
and that's profoundly important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I just think about the work that I do. I mean, everything I do is a tribute to my brother Scott, and it does give me endless energy. Mm-hmm. To go out there and help people that have been where I have been, and to find hope, and to do it as a tribute to him.
Yeah. I also wanted to say, too, that I'm lucky because I have three kids who were 8 and 11 when their grandfather died, and they were absolutely, totally in love with him. I mean, Grandpa could do no wrong at all. And they probably spent more time with my dad as a young person than I did, because he was always busy and gone when I was their age. And they, the way they do grief is so different than the way I do it. They're just out in front with it. If my daughters need to just fall down on the floor and cry sometime, and I'll come up to them like, "Is it Grandpa?" And they're like, "Yes." Something just reminded them of it, so they just weep openly, and they tell stories constantly, and they any little thing can trigger them to talk about him. And I think sometimes I try to manage that. I try to hold it in. I try to make it appropriate, and they just don't. They are unreasonable about their grief, and I think it's wonderful. And that gives me some space to also be unreasonable about it.
Now, do you think that as a child having a parent die, do you feel responsible for the spouse of your parent?
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
And how does that impact your grief?
I'm a little bit more careful sometimes. I think in truth, Gloria, I probably have it boxed up pretty nicely. And I haven't really let it rip yet. Mm-hmm. And part of that's for my mom. I think. And part of it's because I think that's how we were raised. We were really good German Lutherans who kept everything appropriate, And I mean that sincerely. We practiced keeping our emotions in check,
Right.
And so how do you all of a sudden let it go completely when you're grieving? I think we grieve how we're taught to live, and I'm trying to unlearn that in other parts of my life. I'm trying to sort of let myself be who I am in all of my glory and all of my bigness, and I'm so I think I'm trying to grieve big as well. I think we've talked more recently, more openly about how it feels, and she's called sometimes and just cried on the phone, and I'm actually relieved when she does. I really want her to do that more often.
So if you had some advice for somebody who just had a parent die who was, an older parent, what would your advice be?
Don't think that it means you shouldn't be heartbroken and devastated and hurt. An adult and you have kids and your parent is older and they were sick and even, my God, I'm so happy he's not in pain anymore. To give yourself permission to grieve like a child, because that's how it feels. I mean, my dad was my dad was my dad. He was my daddy, and I was, 45 when he died, and it doesn't matter. He was still my dad the same guy who, I went bike riding with and felt like it was the happiest days of my life when I was a kid when I'd get to go bike riding with him. He's still the guy who I passionately argued with as a college student. He's still the one who I looked to for advice. And still to this day feel some sort of yearning for that advice. And I think the biggest thing is don't feel like you shouldn't hurt. Mm-hmm. It's terrible. It's a huge loss. When I was a pastor, one of my parishioners, her father died, and he was younger. He was like in his 50s. And she was in her, maybe he was in his mid-50s. She was a young professional, and she had said that, when he died, the first couple of weeks were sort of okay because everybody else's world stopped too,
Mm-hmm.
And their world had stopped and everyone else's world stopped. But then after the service, everybody else went back to their life. And she said, mine still stopped. I couldn't figure out why everybody else was just fine all of a sudden because my world was still crushed. And I actually understood what she meant at the time and actually thought it was very insightful, but I didn't feel it in my bones until my dad died.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back to work and everybody was like, oh, how are you doing? I'm good. Okay, good. Let's get back to work now. And it was like, wait a minute, stop. I want to get off. We shouldn't be able to just keep going. My dad died.
Well, tell us about your website and tell us what you're doing.
Yeah, I will. I'm taking all of those years of being a pastor and all of the academic knowledge that I have from that, and I am funneling it into a business called The Good Core. And my intention is to work primarily with women to help them identify their own natural inner good core power instead of finding their good worth from outside entities. And so I'm doing life coaching, individual coaching, and also group coaching. I've written my book, Religion Made Me Fat, which is about my journey into my own good core. And my dad's a big part of that. And I'm just launching a series of workshops around the country that's going to be about Religion Made Me Fat and how other people can release from whatever system that is holding them down and telling them they're not allowed to be who they naturally are, their natural goodness. And That's what I'm doing, and I'm very excited about it.
And thank you for dealing with all that goodness, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on the show today.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, AmyJo, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. I can tell that you guys were very connected, so we appreciate that. And
yes,
are very connected, I should say.
Well, thanks for listening to the show today, and tune in again next week, and God bless.
You've been listening to Open to Hope Radio, hosted by Doctors Gloria and Heidi Horsley. Like today's edition, all of our past programs are available on demand at opentohope.com, along with helpful articles, videos, resources, and links to help get you through the toughest time of your life. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and sign up for our monthly newsletter. Again, that's opentohope.com. Check it out today. Then be sure to stop by next Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we'll be posting another edition of Open to Hope Radio. Remember, others have been where you are. They made it through, and you can too, as long as you're open to hope.